Daily Detroit is brought to you by the community. Support our work at patreon.com/dailydetroit.
Hello and welcome to Your Daily Detroit. It is Monday, November 14th, 2022. I'm Jer Stays, and this is episode 1079 of the show. Despite the flashy headlines and ribbon cuttings of Whole Foods, Rivertown Market, and others, the overall number of full-service grocery stores in Detroit is actually on the decline. Although not technically a food desert, many Detroiters are food insecure and underserved. There's also a rise of dollar stores that don't offer much fresh food. Residents are routinely heading to the suburbs to meet their needs, sending hundreds of millions of dollars out of the city. Today, we talk about these issues and get into the ways that people are working on the problem, including the work of the Detroit Food Policy Council. So let's get started. Joining me virtually, Amy Kuras, the Research and Policy Program Manager for the Detroit Food Policy Council. Welcome to Daily Detroit, I believe for the first time.
Yes, it is for the first time. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, a couple listeners pointed this out to me, and I decided to go reading into reports like I do. The Detroit Food Metrics report that you do and your organization does, I think there's a lot of interesting stats and takeaways from it. But first, to set the table, what is it for the uninitiated that the Detroit Food Policy Council works on?
We're a 23-member council. We have folks from across the spectrum of the food system. So we have institutional food, we have K-12 education, we have farmers markets, we have sustainable agriculture, bunches of other things. And then we also have ex officio members from the health department, the city council, and the mayor's office that all work with us. The overarching goal is to kind of break down the silos that can exist between different sectors of the food system and create relationships that then go on to create a more equitable, just, fair food system that the people who use the food system can actually benefit from.
So this report kind of has a lot of information in it to kind of see where we are at as a city when it comes to food and food access. And one of the top line items that caught my and listeners' eyes was that over time, we actually have not made progress when it comes to the number of full-line grocery stores in the city. And I think that surprised some people because you see the high-profile things, whether it's the Whole Foods or the Rivertown Market, things like that. I think people were a little surprised to see like a net loss there.
Yes, that was surprising. In large part, that's driven, the pandemic did not help. That definitely sent a few stores that were sort of on the margin out of business. Also, grocery stores have a very narrow profit margin. So things like inflation, supply chain disruptions, some of the things that we're dealing with now in the economy can have a disproportionate effect on these businesses. So we have lost a few stores since even the last time we did the report.
Wow. So for the city of Detroit, how down are we and what's the goal for a city the size of Detroit?
Yep, we're down right now to 64 full-line grocery stores. That is down 4 from 2019. Our peak a few years ago, I believe, was 73. And the goal is that we have 30,000 square feet of grocery store for every 10,000 people in the city. And obviously, we're not at that goal. We're at 83% of that goal. But even when, a few years ago when there were a few more stores open, we still were not.
So what are some of the challenges that Detroiters face? I mean, as a resident myself, I've generally lived near some sort of grocery store, but I also know that there are lots of areas where people are driving a long way or going to the suburbs or other things. Like, what are some of the challenges that stores in the city are facing?
You just mentioned one of them, which is retail leakage, people going outside the city to shop. One of the other issues is that they run on an extremely thin margin. The profit margin for a grocery store is something between 1% and 3%. So because of that, any kind of shocks to the economy like we're experiencing right now can have a disproportionate effect on grocery stores. So those are some of the major challenges that come for store owners in the city. For the city as a whole, there's actually, there's a lot of talk that the city as a whole is a food desert because we don't have a lot of kind of like name brand grocery stores like your Meijer's or your Whole Foods or Kroger's in the city. But as a matter of fact, there's only a small slice of the city that actually meets the FDA's food desert definition. Alex Hill, who co-authors the report with me, did a study and found that the majority of Detroiters live within a mile, like a full-line grocery store that has basic produce, basic healthy items, enough to kind of serve your weekly needs. So the food desert narrative is somewhat overblown, but what is not is the idea of a food swamp, which means that the food that is most convenient for Detroiters, most affordable, easiest for them to get, is often not optimal in terms of the nutrition offered. So it's packaged foods. It's, people shopping at their neighborhood corner stores. And we do have an initiative that works with that. So it's shopping at their neighborhood corner stores, gas stations, dollar stores, et cetera. And one of the issues there is that they don't always carry a lot of fresh food. So if you're looking for fresh fruits and vegetables, you would need to go to a grocery store for that. And not everyone has one close enough to home to make that feasible.
I can't tell you how many times I've stopped by a dollar store, which it seems like there's more and more of than there used to be. But I'll stop at the dollar store for an item or two, and I'll see people who will be doing almost their full shop at the dollar store, which is just not how I see things for myself. But it's also very clear to me that is a thing that a lot of people do.
Yeah, it is. And your perception is correct. As some of the grocery stores go out of business, they often are replaced with dollar stores. And that's an issue because while dollar stores can offer food very affordably, it's not fresh food. It's often things like canned soup, ramen noodles, things like canned vegetables, things like that are high in sodium and not great for a lot of diet-related diseases that disproportionately affect people in the city.
One thing I've found talking to some residents too is that there may be these grocery stores in the city, but there tends to be, and it seems to be even more so than other kind of shopping verticals, where it's like, well, I want the Kroger or I want this chain thing. And so I'm willing to drive if I've got a vehicle. And we can get into the issue that a lot of Detroit residents do not have access to a vehicle. But those that do end up going to those places. And another thing I found, and this is anecdotally, is that when people start doing their patterns outside of the city for what they need, whether it's going to the Target or the grocery store, or let's say their kids are school of choice, that tends to also kind of push them and drift them towards saying, well, why don't I live closer to all those things? Which also I think ties into maybe even population issues. Again, anecdotally from my perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my own experience has borne that out. I grew up in the city and my family would largely leave the city to go get groceries. And for the same reason that we wanted that chain store, that big chain with the sales and the perception that it's a better store, although they're not always. My own experience has been somewhat similar. 10, 15 years ago, we were considering leaving for the suburbs because all of our shopping was there. A lot of our friends were there. Luckily, as things have progressed in the city, we feel that need less and less. And now I almost never go to the suburbs except to visit my friends who live there because things like the Detroit Mire has opened up, the 8 Mile Mire, which is right by my house. Things like that have been, really helpful to us to be able to continue to keep more of our money in the city. And that is a really important thing for people to be able to keep that money, keep that tax revenue in the city. That then builds the case for potential store owners that there is a market there, and it's kind of becomes a virtuous cycle. To your point about the perception of grocery stores, we are part of the Detroit Grocery Coalition. We're the organizing body for it, but it's also Wayne State, Fair Food Network, Detroit Economic Growth Corporation has participated. So various entities throughout the city. One of the things that they do, and these are Wayne State researchers, go into stores on an annual basis and evaluate using a scale called the NEMS, what is available at different stores. They make sure that there's fresh produce available. We also score them on things that are outside the NEMS, like what does the store look like from the outside? Is the parking lot in good shape? Does it feel safe? How are employees interacting with customers? Is that a respectful and cordial relationship? Things like that. And then we rank them on a scale of 1 to 5 carrots, and the ones who do the best get some banners to hang outside their store from the Detroit Grocery Coalition. They get door signage. We usually will hold an event every year to talk about the stores that have become, we call it the Detroit Great Grocer Program. And so the Great Grocer stores, we make a point of highlighting, and that way the community knows that this is a good store. This is a store that's really putting effort into serving their community.
That seems like a really useful service, and that, especially if you're wanting to spend your dollars in the city, that people should take a look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is available on our website. All the Detroit Grocery Coalition information is available on our website. And we should be doing our kickoff event for this year's and the next month or so, I believe.
Oh, very cool. It's something I'm sure that we will highlight and make sure that's in our newsletter. One thing I wanted to touch on was food insecurity. For listeners who might not know, what defines that and where is the city in that way?
Food insecurity means that a household or a person does not know where their next meal is coming from and that has occurred more than a few times in the previous month. It stops short of the metric of hunger, which is more than people actually have to go without meals for a period of time. But it's a huge problem in the city because of all of the economic stresses that people in the city feel. So the figure that we have in the report is that 69% of households are food insecure. That actually adds a couple of different numbers. One of them is 30% of households in the city live below the poverty line, and 39% of those are what does not meet what's called the ALISH threshold, which stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. And the ALIS index, it was actually started by the United Way, and it looks at beyond the poverty line. It looks at what income, what hourly wage does a family need, and they look at different family configurations. What do they need to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment, a car, but basic car, nothing fancy, internet service, cell service, kind of like the basics of life, like how much do they need to cover the basics? And it is generally far and away ahead of the poverty line, which is the metric that's used to determine where services are needed. But obviously there's this wide gap of people who are above the poverty line, but well below the ALIS index. And so they're struggling. And in some ways that's really an invisible struggle. So I'm a big fan of the ALIS threshold. I think that, personally, if I were in charge of all social policy, that's what we would be using instead of the poverty line in terms of judging who needs services and who doesn't.
Yeah, I think people look at the poverty line and they just kind of assume that it covers everything. But I mean, it really doesn't. Anyone who's got lived experience kind of between the poverty line and, say, the average median income of this region knows that things can still really be touch and go.
Yeah, absolutely. I know when I saw the first ALIS study come out, this was, my kids were small, we were freelancing, we were paying childcare costs, and I was like, oh, this explains a lot as far as why we're always, kind of worried that something expensive is going to break, is that we are way closer to this threshold, even though we're far above the poverty line. So I thought that was, it was a really telling thing, and I think a lot of people have probably lived that because the median income in this area is even below the ALIS index.
Yeah. So what are any other issues that people need to be looking for when they're thinking about food policy? And even thinking about ways to get involved, right? Because, we could talk about the problems all we want, but I think also it's good to focus on some of the solutions and ways people can make things better.
And that is what we do at Detroit Food Policy Council. This is why I love my job, so just cut me off. I'm probably going to talk a lot. One of the great things about food policy is that it intersects on the local, state, and national level. And there's policy governing food at all of those levels. All of us are touched by policy at each of those levels. Like, for example, things like SNAP, the former name for that was food stamps. That is a federal policy, but it impacts people in Detroit because 33% of households use SNAP. So when that becomes a political football, as it often does, and properly funding SNAP and allowing people to get the SNAP benefits they're entitled to without too much interference, that's a federal policy, but it affects people right here in their neighborhoods. The other thing, local policy, one thing that didn't pass was the restaurant grading ordinance that the city council voted down. That is an example of local food policy. Another thing that we've worked on at DFPC a lot is around land use and agriculture. So we have this wonderful community of urban farmers that are doing a lot to improve food security in the city and in their individual communities. But for a long time, it's been very difficult for them to get land. So we've worked with a coalition of people and the city of Detroit to try to ease that process a little bit and make it easier for people to purchase or lease land that they can farm on. And then it's theirs, and those investments that they're making in their farm will hold because they own the land, no matter how much development pressure exists. So there's all kinds of things that are going on. And I would say the best way to get involved is to join us at Detroit Food Policy Council. Our meetings are always open to the public. Right now we're doing them virtually, although we're hoping to get back to in person soon. Our meetings are always open to the public. When they're in person, we bring in food, and anyone is welcome to join and learn more about what's going on in the food system of the city of Detroit. We often have people who are working on projects come and join our meetings so they can talk about them. And, one of my favorite things is to get to introduce those folks to so-and-so over here who is running a study on that and should probably know what you're doing, and making those connections between all these people who are doing really great work in the city. And that's really why Detroit Food Policy Council exists, is that we bring all those different people together so that they're able to know each other, build relationships, and work together.
I think that's so important in Detroit, the city, the region, to bring people together so people are aware of what other folks are doing. Because so often I will hear somebody say, well, I've got this idea for this. And then in the back of my little mental Rolodex, I'll be thinking, I met somebody else who's doing something like that, and maybe they should actually be connected together. And sometimes I'll just quietly send an email and be like, you two are both in the same direction. Why don't you talk, right? Do you know each other? Because I think that's so important to work together, especially in the situation where, resources are often challenged, but also there's so much progress that can be made when you kind of make connections.
Exactly. I think it's somewhat unique to Detroiters, because there's been so much disinvestment in the city for so long, is that people aren't waiting for someone to come along and do it for them. If Detroiters see a problem or they see a need, they're going to jump in and find a way to meet it and marshal resources and marshal people to make that happen. And I think that's one of the things that is so amazing about this city and the people who live in it, is that, it's going to be something as simple as there wasn't a crosswalk on my street, so my neighbor went and painted one. It's just things like that people are very willing to roll up their sleeves and do what needs to be done. And part of our job at DFPC is to connect those people who are rolling up their sleeves, if they can be of help to each other, or just good relationships to have with each other.
Yeah, really putting the shoulder to the wheel. That's something that I have seen myself time and time again. Amy, the program manager, research and policy at the Detroit Food Policy Council, DetroitFoodPC.org if you want the website, because I think you should, if you're interested, follow up on all the things that, Amy, you were talking about. I really do appreciate your time on Daily Detroit.
Absolutely. Thank you for your interest in the report, and feel free to, any of your listeners, feel free to join us at our meetings, and feel free to contact me anytime if you have further questions about food.
Tomorrow, Tuesday, I'll be at Creator Con at the Garden Theater. I'm way down on the bill, where former ESPN journalist and podcaster Jamel Hill is keynoting. So if that's something you want to check out, CreatorConDetroit.com. We have a great week of shows ahead, so don't forget to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to shows. And of course, there's our newsletter, dailydetroit.substack.com, where 3 times a week I'm sending notes with various headlines and stories that just didn't make it into the podcast, but I still think you should know about. Well, with all that, I'm Jer Stays. Thank you so much for listening. Remember that you are somebody, and I'll see you around Detroit.